I have to tell you about this bear. Not a cartoon, not a myth, but a real bear. So let's go back in time. It's 1942. World War II is in full swing. Europe is burning. Cities have been blown to rubble. Millions of people have fled their homes and become refugees. And when I say millions, I mean roughly 40 to 60 million people, and that's just in Europe. And a group of Polish soldiers, part of what's called the Anders Army, are making their way through the Middle East after being released from Soviet labour camps. These men aren't fresh recruits. They aren't marching proudly off to glory. They are far from that. These men are survivors. In 1939, Poland was crushed from both sides, invaded by Nazi Germany in the west and the Soviet Union in the east. The country was split apart almost overnight, and in that chaos that followed, hundreds of thousands of Polish soldiers and civilians were deported deep into Soviet territory, many of them sent all the way to Siberia. They were forced into labour camps, forced into hunger, forced into freezing forests where the winter showed no mercy. It didn't matter who you were. A soldier, a teacher, a parent. Survival became the only thing that mattered. Then, in 1941, everything shifted again. When Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union, a political landscape changed overnight. The Soviets suddenly needed allies, and that meant rethinking what to do with the Polish prisoners that they have been holding. So, Stalin agreed, after significant negotiation, to release thousands of them. Not out of generosity, but necessity. Those freed prisoners were allowed to form a Polish fighting force under General Władysław Anders, and that force would become known as Anders' Army. And despite starvation, illness, and the trauma of being in prison, the army grew, eventually reaching over more than 38,000 soldiers and civilians who had endured unimaginable hardship. Yet, they were now preparing to fight once again. And these men, well, they walked out of Siberia, half-starved, and yet somehow they kept going. They travelled through Central Asia into British-controlled Iran, trying to regroup and trying to rebuild, trying to become soldiers again. They're exhausted, and they've seen things no one should ever see. They've buried friends in frozen grounds. And then, when trekking through Iran, the soldiers came across a young Iranian boy. The boy had found an orphaned Syrian brown bear cub. His mother had been shot by hunters, and the cub had been found wandering alone. He was small enough to fit into someone's arms, and one of the civilian refugees travelling with the soldiers, an 18-year-old Irina, became very fond of the cub. I mean, who wouldn't? They persuaded Lieutenant Anatol to buy him. So, they did just that. They traded for the malnourished cub. A few cans of food, an old Swiss Army knife, and some chocolate. And honestly, I think that might be the most valuable chocolate trade in all of history. They name him Wojtek, which roughly translates to something along the lines of happy soldier. He's soft and clumsy and probably smells like dust and earth. And at the time, he's about the size of a small fluffy dog. But let me tell you right now, he definitely will not stay that size. So let's think about this. You're a group of displaced soldiers. You don't have enough supplies, and you don't have stable housing. And you're actively in the middle of a global war. What do? Well, adopt a bear, apparently. But yet somehow this works. Wojtek becomes the unofficial mascot of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. But here's the thing, he's not just a mascot. He lives with them, he sleeps with them, he travels with them, and he eats with them. He isn't a camp novelty, he's family. At first, he struggles to eat. The soldiers don't have milk for a growing bear cub, so they have no choice but to improvise. They feed him condensed milk from a vodka bottle. Yep, a vodka bottle. I mean, somewhere in the universe that feels very, Polish. He learns to suck from the bottle just like a baby would, and the soldiers take turns feeding him. Imagine hardened men who had survived Siberian labour camps, sitting cross-legged in the desert heat, carefully holding a bottle for a bear cub. There's something profoundly human about that image. Later, as he grows, he graduates to beer, because of course he does. He also becomes strangely fond of cigarettes. Not smoking them, mind you. He eats them, whether they're lit or unlit. Apparently, he liked the taste of paper and tobacco, and the soldiers found this hilarious. And there is a story of him gently taking a cigarette out of someone's lips, mid-drag, and just having a good old munch, which feels like a very specific kind of chaotic energy. Now, here's where things escalate. Wojtek grows, and grows, and grows. Syrian brown bears are not teddy bear sized. Fully grown, they can exceed 400 pounds. Wojtek reaches over 500 pounds. When he stands upright, he's about 6 feet tall. Imagine that. A 6 foot, 500 pound bear still believing and acting like he's a lap-sized cub. But I guess in his head, he's just one of the guys. He loves to wrestle. And by wrestle, I mean casually just tackling grown soldiers for fun. Picture walking across camp, you're carrying something important, and suddenly 500 pounds of fur just grabs you from behind. The men would wrestle him quite regularly, and it became normal. And if he got too rough, they'd just shout at him and he would actually stop. Look embarrassed, try to behave himself. Although I have to say, when he would wrestle, they said he would actually put his claws down, and he never, not once, caused any harm to his soldiers. And never attacked anyone, in fact. He behaved like a well-trained dog, and he was known to be soft, gentle and loving. Although he was known to scare people just by his presence, but he simply wasn't aggressive by nature. But during the unit's time stationed in Iraq, there was one moment that truly cemented his place as a soldier. The camp sat under the relentless Iraqi sun, and like he often did, Wojtek would visit the shower blocks to cool off. It was part of his routine, a small relief from the dry heat that hung over the camp each day. But one afternoon in Iraq, something wasn't right. One of the doors at the shower blocks was slightly open, and when Wojtek pushed his way inside, instead of an empty washroom, he found a man hiding in there, believed to be a spy scouting the camp, possibly in preparation for a raid. The man screamed in terror at the sight of the fully grown bear filling the doorway. The noise echoed through camp and immediately alerted the guards. By the time they arrived, Wojtek had the spy cornered, calmly but firmly blocking any chance of escape. He didn't understand espionage. He didn't know military strategy. But on that day in camp, simply by being exactly who he was, he had protected his whole unit. Such a good boy. He learned social boundaries, which is not something you would expect to say about a bear. He also learned to salute, and I'm not making this part up. When soldiers saluted, he would raise his paw. Just imagine how that must have felt for the morale of the soldiers, to see this wild animal copying them and watching them, just like a child does a parent. In a war defined by destruction, here is this enormous creature earnestly copying human gestures of respect. Now, here's where the story takes one of the most absurd turns. In 1944, the unit was preparing to move to Italy to fight in the Allied campaign, specifically the Battle of Monte Cassino. But there was a problem. British transport regulations did not allow animals aboard military ships, which, in fairness, seems reasonable. Can you imagine the paperwork? Cargo, artillery, supplies, and one bear. So, what did the Polish soldiers do? Well, they enlisted him. Not symbolically, I mean, they officially enlisted him. Wojtek was given the rank of private. He was given his own service number, his own paybook, and ration papers. And he was formally listed as a soldier in the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. Problem solved. Although I do imagine somewhere a British logistics officer probably took a deep breath and said, "Fine, the bear can come." So let's talk about the Battle of Monte Cassino. It was absolutely brutal. 4 separate Allied assaults, months of fighting, steep hills, heavy German fortifications, and thousands of casualties. The Polish Second Corps was tasked with taking the monastery at the top of Monte Cassino. Wojtek's unit handled ammunition transport. And here's the part that sounds like a myth, but is actually supported by eyewitness accounts. Wojtek helped carry the shells, crates filled with 25-pound shells. The story goes that he saw the soldiers carrying them and simply copied them. He would walk upright, lift a crate, and carry it to the artillery positions. No dropping, no distraction, no mauling anyone, just simply business. The soldier said he never once dropped a single crate. Now, imagine being a German soldier looking downhill through all the smoke and all the chaos and seeing a literal bear just hauling ammunition uphill. I mean, talk about accidental psychological warfare. So because of this, after the battle, the 22nd Artillery Supply Company changed its emblem to a bear carrying an artillery shell, and that became their official insignia. Not because it was cute, but because it was accurate. Now, outside the battle, Wojtek was just, well, still Wojtek. He loved to drink beer, he loved wrestling, he loved riding in the front seat of trucks, and he would get quite annoyed if he was placed in the back seat. He would mimic the soldiers marching, he tried to copy drills, and he disliked being alone more than he disliked loud explosions. There are stories that during air raids he would become very anxious and seek out his men for comfort. Now, this is the detail that gets me. The same bear carrying artillery shells still needed reassurance and still needed his men close to him. After the war, the Polish Second Corps was stationed in Scotland at Winfield Camp near Hutton in Berwickshire. But here's the painful reality. Poland had fallen under Soviet control. Many of the soldiers could not safely return home. They were exiles. Their country existed, but not in the way that they had fought for. And through all of that transition, Wojtek stayed with them and became something stable. Local Scottish civilians visited the camp to see the famous bear soldier. Children adored him, He posed for photographs, he wrestled gently, and he accepted snacks with enthusiasm. But eventually the army was demobilised, and the big question became unavoidable. What do you do with a £500 war veteran who also happens to be a bear? Well, in 1947, he was moved into the Edinburgh Zoo. On paper it made sense, but in reality it must have been devastating. His whole life so far, all he had known was sleeping in tents, the sounds of engines, voices speaking Polish, mess halls, shared routines, and travelling with his men. And now he was in an enclosure. Former soldiers would visit him at the zoo and call out to him in Polish, and of course he recognised them. He would perk up and greet them and would look visibly overjoyed. Some even climbed into the enclosure to wrestle him again. And the zoo allowed this sometimes because he reacted differently with them. I mean, after all, they were his family. Wojtek lived until 1963. He was around 22 years old, and here's something important. Wojtek isn't just a charming war anecdote. For Polish soldiers who lost their homeland, he represented unity. He survived the Middle East. He survived Monte Cassino. He survived exile. They went through it all together. In 2015, a statue of Wojtek was unveiled at Edinburgh Princes Street Gardens. It shows him standing beside one of his soldiers, which is such a beautiful place. It's full of life and nature, and if you haven't been, I would recommend going for a visit. The plaque beside them reads, "Wojtek, in memory of Polish men and women who fought for your freedom and ours." There are statues of him in Poland. He's on memorial plaques. He's in children's books and documentaries. But the reason this story lasts isn't the statues. I think it's the tenderness. He wasn't weaponized. He wasn't forced into combat. He wasn't turned into a spectacle for propaganda. He was just included. He copied what the soldiers did because he saw them as his group, and maybe that's the most human thing about him. Now let me leave you with this. In the middle of one of the darkest wars in human history, a group of exhausted refugee soldiers looked at a lonely bear cub and said, "You are definitely coming with us." They made room for something soft, something absurd, yet something alive. And that decision didn't win the war, but it might have helped them survive it. And sometimes that's just as important, because out of all of the destruction, a bear carried ammunition, drank beer, saluted, got anxious during air raids, and waited for Polish voices at a zoo years later. And that story somehow refuses to disappear. Not because it's unbelievable, but because it reminds us that even in war, there is still room for loyalty. There is still room for gentleness. And occasionally, there is still room for a £500 private named Wojtek. So if you made it this far, I'd like to say thank you. I hope you enjoyed the video. Feel free to subscribe. I have many more videos lined up, and I really enjoyed making this one. Bye for now.